Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we're going to talk about Surprise V-Wars Season 1, Episode 3. I really love this show. I don't know if y'all have given it a shot yet on Netflix, but I highly encourage it. Although this show has its problem areas, just like any other show, it's a lot of fun, and it also takes a really holistic, in-depth approach to the issue of vampires. It's not just taking a look at them as fantasy characters or horror characters, but also as sci-fi characters. They provide us with a scientific reasoning behind there being vampires, which I very much enjoy overall. It's a refreshing take, and I recognize that this isn't the only show or sci-fi approach to vampires, but it is overall one of my favorites so far. It has great sociocultural and political commentary, and is very evocative of many current events. We've spoken about the timeliness of this show in the past, but we will go ahead and cut that short right now to cut to the chase. Today's episode that we're reviewing is called Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is a reference to an Emily Dickinson poem. So today we are going to work through this episode with the recaps first. Then we're going to talk about the concept of brother against brother. And in our final segment, if you stick around, we're going to talk about Emily Dickinson's poem and The Cat and the Cradle and the Silver Spoon. So first up, let's recap this episode. So, in our last episode, we really ended with Luther just quietly watching Des sleep, not knowing that they are being watched by Niklos. So that's a little disconcerting, and as nice as Niklos was to Swan's face, we really get the sense that he is more of a villain than anything else. And him watching over them all but confirms it. He is watching over them just about in the same manner as Homelander watches over people in The Boys. It's honestly more threatening and insidious than it is anywhere near being fatherly or helpful or protective. So with this episode, we see a lot of blood everywhere as these 6 initial people are killed by a couple of vampires. We don't know how the 2 vampires were infected, but Luther did tell us in the previous episode that prions can remain viable for weeks in an individual area. So there are a multitude of ways that Michael could have passed it on to other people. We already have seen that with his dentist, and again with Monster, who was working on Michael's bike. And both became infected, with the dentist ultimately committing suicide, ostensibly, and the other person, Monster, seeming to have turned. But he is in a gang, and we're not precisely sure what he is going to do. As time goes on, we see a woman begin to succumb to the effects of the prion infection. And we know that Michael has been out with her in the past. They've been on dates and seem to be pretty familiar with each other. Her name is Danica, and she seems to be some type of real estate agent or something like that. And she is going over the details of a new house at what appears to be like a housewarming party when she begins to start having these new super sense symptoms. So she speaks with her sister, Mila, and really says, that they have a lot to talk about with their mom and how she is going. You get the sense that there's some kind of medical issue that is underlying all this, like a power of attorney, and they seem to be very upset with each other. You can tell that one of them is a lot more involved with the care of their mother than the other, and that the other is very carefree and just not entirely responsible. You get this sense of like Antigone and Ismene almost, in a sense. Or almost kind of like the two sisters in The Taming of the Shrew, with their sense of what needs to be done and their disdain for what should be done. Now, Danica is not overall super disdainful. She's more carefree, like Antigone, although Antigone does have this sense of justice and of right from wrong and morality. So it's not a true one-to-one comparison in that regard. But you get where I'm coming from, in that one of these sisters is a lot more mature and responsible and attentive to the needs of their ailing mother, and the other is really just more out there to have a good time. So Danica, the one who is mostly just seemingly out to have a good time, is at some house event when she starts getting these symptoms. And so she ends up going over to her sister's house, and she doesn't feel very well, but she still goes ahead and does it. And when she gets there, her sister starts giving her a hard time about their family. So Mila is really just being like, hey, I need you to sign this paperwork for Mom. Finally, I'm glad that you're here. And it's just giving her a hard time when Danica really starts to get even more sick, really. And she suddenly turns right then. So it's a little bit abrupt in the way that Danica is being overcome with this, opposed to how we've kind of seen it in the past. And it suggests she might be a little bit different than the other vampires we've seen so far. But we also see that the bloodthirst is immense and just overwhelming. She goes ahead and rips her sister's throat out right there in her own home. And it's very grim and seemingly without remorse. Whereas Michael at least is able to walk away later on from the lady who is blind at the bus station. And he seems to feel upset in some type of way about having killed that woman in his apartment, or her apartment, that he and Luther had covered up. So this is a little bit different. Danica might regret it, but she almost just seems to relish in the bloodlust. And that's kind of how her personality was before. Michael was more of a kind, loving, down-to-earth person, and Danica was already selfish before. So perhaps this is also just magnifying parts of us that were already present before, or it's just expressing the bloodlust to different degrees based on whether people were more selfless or selfish before they are turned via epigenetics. So we do see that this contagion is truly branching out quite quickly, and it makes you think a little bit of the contact tracing with COVID-19. So Michael has first obtained this prion disease and become a vampire, and he's been to his dentist, and his dentist has then also been turned, and he's given it to Danica, and then the person who is fixing his bike gets the infection as well. So it's just from respiratory droplets. He's not even actually bitten these people. Just like how he originally came across the prion disease and how Luther became a carrier for it and brought it home to Jess. Is Des going to turn at some point? Is Claire O'Hagan or Niklos going to turn? We're not quite sure yet. It may be that with being a carrier, you have to actually exchange bodily fluid. Maybe he's not actively shedding cells. Luther, that is. Michael appears to be, as even his dentist got sick, the person fixing his bike, and one of the women he had an intimate relationship with before. So this contact tracing is about to get crazy complicated. We know that Michael was already infectious prior to the point at which he actually succumbed to the bloodlust. Because he went to see his dentist first, remember? Because his teeth were sore. So Danica may have already spread this at that housewarming event that she was at before she went over and the bloodlust overcame her at her sister Mila's house. We're not entirely sure. Did she stop at McDonald's or Panera along the way? I don't know. It makes the contact tracing infinitely more complex, and that's honestly how it works in real life. It's truly exponential to trace back whom all you've come in contact with and then whom each of these other people have come into contact with. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to pick up with where we left off with Kaylee. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Danica's relationship with her sister Mila and how this new emergence of vampirism really shows us the difficulty of contact tracing and starts to give us an idea of how this disease is really spread. So once we get more than just a handful of characters who have been overcome by the infection, then we can start seeing some true patterns emerging. Again, that's the importance of having larger sample sizes. They make those patterns come up in stark relief, and they can also show you what is a significant pattern and what is perhaps just chance. So in this case, we are seeing that these folks are turning perhaps more rapidly than they were before, and are immediately just being overcome, but that they may also be infecting folks prior to the bloodlust overcoming them. So does this also spread by bites? I guess we'll find out if it's bites or just respiratory droplets and other types of bodily fluids. But I would think that if it was spreading through bodily fluids like it did from Luther to his wife Jess, that's very likely also going to be transmitted via the bloodstream in other individuals. So it stands to reason that if one of these vampires bites someone else, that perhaps they will turn. So far, we've mostly just seen people die and get their throats ripped out. Let's see what happens. Maybe this is going to be like Vampire Diaries or something, where you have to drink the vampire's blood first. We'll find out. Up next, though, we're going to talk a little bit about what Kaylee's been up to. I like Kaylee's character. Well, I like her as a character. As a person, she could seem kind of obnoxious, but I do admire her dedication to the truth. So, a lot of Kaylee's dedication seems to be mostly impacted by money and just a sense of reveling in chaos more than truly bringing out the truth because she thinks the people have a right to know. But there is some sense of real journalistic integrity, I suppose, or at least a journalistic approach when it comes to Kaylee's work. And she's willing to risk a lot to get the answers. Michael very well could have killed her when she first went in to go and meet him. And so she is perhaps not a great person, but she is a very dedicated journalist, and I will give her that. So she has been leaking this truth on her website called Revel Leaks, and she's leaked as much as she's known to be the truth. So she has been in Luther's house and has seen that Jess has been killed in there and talked to her friend who works for the police station and seen a picture of Michael with Luther in there. So since she knows that there's a connection between the two, she has now decided she's going to use her journalistic experience to sort out some type of connection and get as much information as she can about Luther or Michael. So she reaches out to Luther's ex-wife, Rachel, who is Dez's mom. Rachel is played by Nikki Reed, and you may remember her as playing Rosalie in the Twilight Saga. She and Ian Somerhalder are actually married in real life, and I think that's pretty neat as a fact about the show, and that they both came from vampire shows in their emergence as actors. So that's pretty neat, and I liked seeing both of them on screen together, especially playing opposing sides. That's always really fun when married actors get to do that with each other. So Rachel is really seemingly estranged from both Luther and Dez. We know from the previous episode that Luther really did not want Dez handed off to Rachel's custody, and that Dez seemed a little bit alarmed about perhaps seeing his mother as well. Rachel does seem to have some issues she's working through, but she does love Dez very much. So Kaylee goes and interviews Rachel and kind of pushes Rachel to say certain things by preying on Rachel's want to see her son. And then they put this interview online, and Dez sees it as well as Luther, who gets very upset, reasonably so, by this encounter. But Kaylee is kind of messed up in taking this approach, but we get it from her perspective. She doesn't understand exactly what's going on. She's not privy to a lot of the details. And so she's just putting two and two together the way that makes the most sense to her. She doesn't know that this is really just a virus. She does know that there is essentially a vampire out there murdering people. And perhaps more than one, since Luther also killed his wife Jess. In the meantime, we have Michael out there trying to escape. He's just trying to get out of the Seneca area and is still walking and or driving by stealing cars to get away from there. I'm not sure how big this area is because it's taking him a while to get out of there, but Who knows? I have lived in San Antonio, and I've been to places like Houston wherein it can take you at least an hour to get across town to another part of Houston that's still technically considered to be Houston, but is nonetheless super far away. Whereas from my hometown area, you can get all the way across town in about 2 minutes. So it just depends. I'm not familiar with this place called Seneca, but I digress. It's just taking Michael a long time to get out of there. Luther, in the meantime, though, is also working on this cure with DNS. He's not even at the cure point, though. He's still trying to examine what the heck is even going on. He has his hunches about the prions, but he's not entirely sure how they work, by what mechanism they are impacting people, why some folks are not seemingly affected by it, but can be asymptomatic carriers, while others definitely get it. He's getting this information as we are, and just using his expertise to put 2 and 2 together as he goes along, from an epidemiological perspective, even as Kaylee is doing it from the journalistic one, and Michael is just figuring things out as he goes along, as these events happen to him. So Luther decides to go and see Rachel, because Des really wants to go see his mom. He sees her on the television, and he misses his mom, even if she wasn't someone who was stable or safe for him to be around before. So Luther tells him that he'll think about it, and makes an appointment at a local restaurant with Rachel to meet up with her. At which point, he also tells her that Des is in the car and he wants to just talk to her first. But while he's sitting there, he is gauging her reaction to things, and Rachel is reacting really poorly. But you can tell that there's a lot of history there, because she also already has a gut feeling that her ex-husband did not bring their son with him at all. And it turns out that she's right, and she's very upset by that, because it's also her son. Des is her son, and she loves him. So she feels a bit bamboozled and is frustrated by the fact that Luther has lied to her about this. And you get a sense that she hasn't seen Des in a while. And regardless of whether or not Luther is justified in that, you can understand also how that could be really upsetting to Rachel. And her emotions are really keyed up because of it. He got her hopes up for seeing her child, and now they have effectively been dashed. Now she does kind of go off the rails a little bit, and they are fighting rather loudly in this restaurant. But right when we are seeing that they're about to maybe really get into it, there is a guy who comes in from DNS and stops him, and stops Rachel really from hurting Luther at all, and informs him that yeah, he's followed him over there and is there just to make sure everything goes fine. But we also know that Luther carries this infection, and while we're fairly certain that he has transmitted it to Jess via bodily fluids from when they had intercourse, we can't entirely be certain that that is the only way in which this virus spreads. So it's a little wacky that Luther is allowed to leave at all to go and meet up with Rachel, let alone in a public place. That's like if you thought you were at risk for COVID-19, or you had perhaps asymptomatically spread it to someone, and then they're like, yeah, you can go ahead and meet up for visitation at your local restaurant. Go ahead and go to Denny's. It's totally fine. That seems super weird to me. I'm not sure why they met indoors. I'm sure Luther wanted it to be in public, seeing as how Rachel reacts. However, it also seems to be kind of dicey. Is DNS hoping he's going to infect more people and they're watching him so that they can pay attention to the contact tracing? Was the guy who was watching out for him, was he in the parking lot before, just taking down people's license plate numbers for contact tracing later? Who knows? That seems like something shady that the government would do, but, that's going a little bit more on an X-Files tangent. DNS has shown us so far that they have the capability to be shady, but not that they're necessarily shady all around. The guy watching out for Luther actually seems pretty legit, and so does Claire O'Hagan to a certain extent. So perhaps it's not all government conspiracies, but then again, maybe it is. We see that a lot in the X-Files too. Sometimes you're like, wow, that guy's a good guy, and then you're like, oh no, he's also a part of the problem. So we'll find out as this story goes along. But it is weird that they let Luther go do this, even after they have blackmailed him into keeping his son there in this weird room that they are living in, and also him having to go and work in this lab every day. So I don't know about all that, or Luther actually leaving Des with these wackadoo people, but I digress. That is something that happened. It just seemed really odd to me. You'd think his time would be dedicated to either staying with his son or working on this project, and granted, like the lengths that DNS went to secure him working for them, it's super weird that they let him go at all. I'm just saying. But now we also see that they're allowing Luther to go with them on the hunt for Michael. And they are saying that he's now kind of an apex predator in a way. He's able to kill folks quite easily, and they've seen this firsthand when he was at the hospital. So now someone has tracked him to the side of the road, and 2 cops have gotten out of the car and chased him into the woods, and we're not entirely sure what's happened to both of them. But on this hunt, we do shortly thereafter find that one has been essentially staked up on a tree limb, and the other one is elsewhere. So he's able to very brutally kill people. And think about how sharp an object would have to be to completely pierce through someone's torso. And he did this with essentially a blunt tree limb. So that's really hardcore. That was not meant to go ahead and go through somebody's body to begin with. It's not super sharp. And he still managed to do that with brute force, which kind of implies a lot about Michael's abilities and perhaps the abilities of the other vampires. We don't know yet if he is going to have that sire factor that you see in a lot of vampire shows where he is the strongest, but this doesn't really seem to be correlated with age or anything like that. It just seems to be that instead of that fanciful notion of the sire and how you can kill the sire and it will kill that entire lineage of vampires, that this is genetic in nature, and it doesn't seem to be logical that killing Michael would turn off those genes in all of the other vampires. So I think that if you killed him, they would also all still stay vampires. And so he's probably not going to be stronger than the others, just by virtue of being the first in this new emergence of an old prion disease. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about this episode as it relates to Luther versus Michael, and some questions it gives us, as well as the concept of brother fighting brother. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were catching up with where Kaylee and the others are in this episode, including Luther meeting up with Rachel and lying to her about bringing their son Des with them. Rachel did not like this, and it was a very fraught situation. But a DNS agent, who actually seems pretty chill, goes ahead and bails him out, and he's fine. However, some cops have called in that they have found Michael, and then they disappeared somewhere in the woods trying to look for him. So DNS weirdly allows Luther to help hunt for Michael. And Michael has definitely gotten super strong. We knew he was strong earlier when he broke that porcelain sink, but seeing that he's been able to impale someone on a blunt tree limb is pretty hardcore. And this episode does a lot in how it is approaching the narrative of the relationship between all of the characters. We see a lot in this. We see the interactions between Luther and Des and Luther's ex-wife and also Michael and Luther. And it just really is evocative of the concept of brother against brother. And I mean that both in the Civil War reference and also in the biblical philosophical reference. So, brother against brother is also often used as an allusion to the Civil War. And that can be the Civil War in the United States or also the Civil War from the Avengers. It's a civil war where you're fighting against others from your own group. Essentially, it's infighting, and it's about obtaining rights for a group. We haven't really gotten that far into the story yet, but we do know that Michael and Luther are essentially brothers. Maybe not by blood, but certainly by bond. And this is really pitting them against each other. And we see that in many ways, where Michael isn't listening to Luther, and he's putting Luther in a sketchy situation by asking him to help him cover up a crime. And then Luther, even though he believes that Michael needs help, he is still going and reporting him to the cops to get him into custody so that they can try to get him some help. Although that is certainly misguided. But you can understand, perhaps, why Luther took that approach in a system that didn't seemingly give him any other emergency alternatives. It's not a great system. But Luther has really betrayed his brother in his brother's eyes, because it has led to him being arrested and being cuffed to his hospital table as well. We also see that Luther is not entirely trusted by Michael, and Michael is really kind of scary in Luther's opinion right now. He feels that his brother won't really hurt him, but he knows he's very capable of hurting other people. However, Luther still knows that deep down, Michael is still who he was before. He's still a good person. It's not that he's a bad person in any way. As Luther says, he's just sick right now. So Luther goes on the hunt with them, and he ends up seeing the body of the cop who's been put up on the tree, and Luther gives him a call to give Michael a heads up that they're after him. Now, we see that Luther is still on the side of Michael right now. Luther is on the side of truth and of protecting people, and he doesn't think that killing Michael is going to solve this problem at all. And furthermore, he doesn't really want to see his brother harmed. He honestly does believe what he is telling DNS. I think it's a little bit weird we didn't get to see Luther more upset or in mourning about his wife's death, his current wife at the time, Jess, especially considering he had to kind of beat her to death with an iron poker. But I suppose he doesn't have a lot of time for grief right now. He's kind of living in a war zone, and he's under constant pressure from DNS and having to worry about how this is affecting his son and whether he's going to be able to stop this before it becomes a true pandemic, and whether they're going to catch and kill his brother. So he is really going through quite a bit. So I guess that we have a lot going on in this episode. We have Monster turning into a vampire monster, and he's part of a motorcycle club or a gang, which is kind of like a fraternity in the basic sense of the word, that it's a group of brothers. So a lot of this is about brotherhood. It's about the difference between bonds through blood and how kinship is not necessarily defined by blood, but how those kinship lines or those bonds can be realigned and changed, almost like in a Venn diagram way, as people change over time. I firmly do believe that we can be many different people in our lives. And I don't mean wholly different personalities or anything like that, just that we are both nature and nurture. We are cultural animals. So we can take parts of who we were originally and become something else based on our environment, based on what happens to us. And we're taking this quite literally in V-Wars oftentimes, because epigenetics is a component of how your environment can impact your gene expression, how it's affecting who you are, how you express yourself, your phenotype. But that can happen culturally as well. So it's not just that Michael is undergoing these changes on a phenotypic level, but also that he is having this reckoning with his relationship with Luther and what that is based on. And Luther is trying to still find the person in Michael who Michael was before. But sometimes parts of us do die along the way. And loving someone is largely about learning to love them and accept them as they are. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to make excuses for toxic traits. People can be definitely toxic. Even in ourselves, sometimes we can be the toxic individuals. We're the heroes in our own stories, but we are possibly the villains in other people's stories, or even just NPCs. So we're seeing that Michael is taking a different approach here. I think that perhaps as time goes by, he may understand Luther's perspective a little more, but he's still in the early stages of being hurt by what Luther has done in turning him in. He thought that he could trust his brother above all else to help him out, even when it came to covering up a crime. But we see that Luther, while he cares deeply for his brother, also has some deeply held beliefs that are really kind of messing with him and his personal integrity regarding the situation that Michael is in right now. So it is kind of pitting brother against brother, and it's like the Avengers Civil War that way as well. We saw Captain America and Tony Stark fighting, And indeed, they were in many ways like brothers, not just in the relationship that they have as adults, but also in the way that Howard Stark treated Tony and treated Cap. And they both had sincerely, deeply held beliefs regarding why they thought that superheroes should be registered or why they shouldn't be. And we see that happening with Luther and with Michael as this time goes on as well. And the vampires wanting to be recognized as the creatures that they are. Because after all, they haven't changed in their DNA at all. It's just the expression of DNA that was already there based on an epigenetic change. So they are perhaps still even the same species. We're not sure if humans and vampires in this story can breed together. Maybe they can. They are reproductively compatible based on their sexual organs, but I don't know if enough has changed to make them incompatible with this new epigenetic component. I want to hypothesize that they technically could breed with each other, the vampires and the humans, because these sections of the DNA were already in their bodies. Remember, epigenetics does not change the DNA itself. It doesn't change the genetic code. It just changes its expression. Epigenetics turns genes on and off. So this vampire gene was turned off in these folks until they came into this encounter with the prions, whether that's through sexual relations or respiratory droplets or interactions with saliva. So we know that that was there all along. So unless there's something on that section of the epigenetics that have been turned on that would also affect reproduction, then you very well could have vampire-human hybrids in the show, or vampire children born to other vampires. I'm kind of stoked to see where that goes, and I'm super tempted to pick up all of the graphic novels for this series. I love the concept of brotherhood that's in the show. It's not just about vampires. It's not just about science and climate change and epigenetics and sociocultural stuff and sociopolitics, which we get into more in the next few episodes. But it is largely about family dynamics. That's one of the things I love the most about Santa Clarita Diet. And that's also one of my favorite things about the Vampire Diaries series, including the spin-offs, the originals, and legacies. You start out thinking that it's like Twilight and that it's about a couple of vampires who are in love with a teenage girl, but it becomes so much more than that, and you realize later on that that show is also not about the girl at all. It's about the relationship between the brothers, and really, her character is just meant to mediate that story between the two and to help develop the story further. Some of my favorite episodes in Vampire Diaries do not feature Elena at all. Don't get me wrong, Nina Dobrev is a great actress and I loved her work too, but I really enjoyed that dynamic between the brothers, and that's also something that I enjoy in shows like Supernatural and in the group dynamics of the team in Stargate SG-1. It's about family, and sometimes it's about found family, and other times it's about just fighting within your family when you have different beliefs or different approaches to the problem. And you see that in some parts of the Bible as well. I am not particularly religious at this point in my life, but I have read the Bible quite a bit growing up. Read the entire book. Quite familiar with it. So there is a part of it that this episode reminded me of, where Jesus is speaking to a group of folks and says that he is not there to bring peace per se, but a sword, and to pit brother against brother. family members against other family members. It's just a long list of different types of family members. And really, it's about a path diverged and families being put at odds due to their specific beliefs or desires. And in the Bible, that's really meant to say, hey, I'm just really here to bring you the truth. A lot of times, the truth is represented as a sword. And that includes both in a lot of video games I like to play and in the Bible. There's one section in Ephesians that talks about the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is defined in there as being the Word of God, or really the Bible, which is also referred to as being the ultimate truth. So perhaps he is also referring to the concept that he is just bringing forth the truth and presenting it there, and people are going to make their own decisions and value judgments based on their beliefs, and that perhaps the ties of family will not be strong enough in and of themselves to maintain those bonds. And that's what we see really here, where the truth is that Michael is not any genetically different. He's only epigenetically different. His DNA hasn't changed, just his expression, just as it did with Jess. And Luther, his brother, still loves him, but he also believes that Michael can't keep going around and killing people, drinking their blood, that that's not okay. So Luther thinks that this is something that needs to be cured. And for folks like Michael, perhaps this is just a natural result of evolution, and it's who he is as a person. And he doesn't want that to be something that should be hunted down or being sought to extinguish, which is what DNS and the others seem to be doing and what Luther seems to be doing. So Michael is on the run from all of them. And as much as Luther wants to help him, though, and as much as Luther wants to make sure that Michael is treated, he's also not willing to put Michael in a situation to be killed now that he has understood his mistake in reporting Michael to the cops to begin with. So he does call his brother and give him a heads up that he needs to run while they are in the forest. Is DNS going to find out about that? I'm not entirely sure. It's going to be bad news bears if they do. And it could really put Luther's son Des at risk. But I'm sure that that is something that Luther is already aware of. And this tie to his brother Michael is still important enough for him to take that chance. We're going to go on a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about this concept of Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is the title of this episode. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the concept of brother against brother, allusions to the Civil War, both the American type and the Marvel type, which is also American in its own way, I suppose. And then the Bible verses that are related to the sword of truth and also pitting brother against brother, which is really what this episode seems to be about in my personal opinion. There's a truth that has been presented to everyone, and that is that this epigenetic change is something that's natural. It's already in human DNA. It is natural in the most literal sense of that word. And nurture has impacted nature. And so this is viewed as a disease by some people, that it needs to be exterminated or just removed from the body so that they become regular humans again. And for others who are living with this, it's not really an illness to them. And that reminds me somewhat of folks in the deaf community, or folks who are living with different types of dwarfism. Some folks think that they should be working on trying to hear if they're deaf. They think that deaf folks should get cochlear implants or get hearing aids. And a lot of hearing people do not understand why folks in the deaf community might shun that, why they might not want to be in the hearing community. But indeed, many deaf individuals do not. And when we talk about the deaf community, we talk about deafness with a capital D because it is their community. So that does mean something different. And one of my friends is an ASL interpreter, and she has also spoken recently to me about how COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting people who are in the deaf and hard of hearing community. Because with all these masks, they can't read folks' lips, and they also are not able to see some of the cues that go along with ASL. For the hearing community, for those of us who aren't really familiar with ASL, a lot of us think of it as primarily being hand and arm movements. But there are very many facial expressions that also accompany the different signs for different words and the different meanings. So if you're out there and you're wanting to make these face shields or these face masks for folks, maybe consider making the kind that have the plastic shielding around the mouth that's translucent or transparent so that folks in the deaf and hard of hearing communities can also understand what you're saying. I can only imagine how jarring it may be to not be able to suddenly understand what anyone around you is saying in something that is truly about apocalyptic right now, much as it is apocalyptic in V-Wars. So keep that in mind, and if you are making those masks or you're purchasing one for yourself, even if you do not personally know anyone in the deaf or hard of hearing community, I really encourage you to think about getting those types of masks just to really be considerate of the others around us. After all, that's also the point of the masks. So while we're out there being considerate about spreading germs, we might as well also be considerate about how we are communicating with the world around us, including those who are not necessarily just like us. We are only as safe or protected as the most vulnerable amongst us. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Similarly, in communities like the dwarfism community, there are people out there who have different lives than we do, and it's not necessarily considered to be a disability. Just as many folks in the deaf community do not consider deafness to be a disability. Their community is much like the hearing community, but it also has some really wonderful cultural differences. It's not about just being different from the hearing community. It's its own community in and of itself, and it's valuable in its own right, as is the dwarfism community. Some types of deafness, just like dwarfism, are genetic in their basis. So this is just some human variation that is encoded in our DNA. And very similarly, we can view this type of vampirism in this specific instance of V-Wars as not being something unnatural. It's not a disability. It's not an illness from where the people who are experiencing it stand. And I think that's one of the largest values of sci-fi. Sci-fi provides allegories for understanding different communities or contexts in the world around us through representation in ways that might be more stark or apparent. So by making it vampirism, it takes some of the wind out of the sails of folks who might get their chests a little puffed up with outrage when you are saying that something like this is not a disability or an illness. But there are very many people out there in the world who undergo similar types of issues. Not in that they are sucking the blood out of other people, just that at the very base level, they have genetic or epigenetic components that are different from people who don't have those genetic components or don't have those genes expressed. And just because your genes are expressing one way does not mean that the gene expression that is happening around you and other individuals is necessarily a disability or an illness. And that's really another strong point that I get out of this episode. So that's the big difference here, is that it's almost offensive in a way that Luther is viewing this as an illness to Michael. So Michael is kind of figuring out that this is who he is as a person. And after the initial onset of transitioning into vampirism, once those epigenetic changes have already taken place, he doesn't seem to have as severe bloodlust. He's not having the headaches and stuff anymore, and he seems to have mastery over these super senses. So for him, this is becoming a normal way of life. Humans can adapt to anything that they can become accustomed to, and that is what is happening with Michael and the other vampires that have been exposed to these prions and whose epigenetic changes have responded in a way that has resulted in them expressing vampiric phenotypic changes. This is their new normal, much the same as some folks in the real world today who become exposed to substantial amounts of air pollution and get their methyl tags altered in their DNA. Scientists have found that that could increase a person's risk for neurodegenerative disease. But for many folks, what is one person's disease or disability or illness is another person's just flat out reality. For people who don't live with these things day to day, with these experiences and so on, it might be difficult to understand, but it's important that you seek to understand on your own. And if you are interested in that type of concept, I encourage you to check out shows like V-Wars, because that's the crux of this episode, at least in my opinion. If Michael just wanted to go through and kill tons of people, he could, but he sits down and speaks with the lady who is blind at the bus stop about her life and what it's like for her to be sitting there at the bus stop blind. He has super senses, and her senses are different from his. And he wants to understand it. And he takes the time to speak with her, and then he leaves without harming her, even though he very well could. He's not interested in harming the most vulnerable, as he considers it, around him. He is interested in eating to survive, for the most part. But you have other characters like Monster, who is in the motorcycle club, who is clearly turned and is willing to just kill anyone. But again, much like how Danica was more selfish beforehand and Michael was more selfless beforehand, someone who already had a penchant towards violence very well may be extra violent after they have turned. So it makes a lot of sense as we are seeing this spectrum of vampirism expression and how everyone is really reacting differently based on their initial pre-vampiric personalities. But I think that all of this can change in our character and our personality as time goes on. And even if you are a distasteful person at a certain time in your life, you can change your mind and do better, because we are made up of the choices that we make every single day. And because of that, that means that any time is a great time to begin making change. So if you did not have an understanding of genetic variances related to the dwarfism community or the deaf community before, and how many folks don't consider those to be illnesses or disabilities, I encourage you to read more about that online, or to reach out to websites like Little People of America to learn on their website from folks who are living that experience, to see what they want you to understand about their experience. You can also go to websites like nationaldeafcenter.org to get an introduction to the deaf community by the deaf community in a preformed way that puts the emotional labor onus on you and not on grilling people from these communities about information that is easily read about online first. So this website will tell you about some of the unique features of deaf culture, and Little People of America will also tell you about some unique features of their culture. And you can also explore the wide range of variability in identity within these cultures and how folks identify, as not all deaf individuals identify with deaf culture in whole or in part. We're going to see that concept explored a lot more in V-Wars as we see more types of vampires be born, activated. I'm not exactly sure how to refer to it in this context, but as we see these epigenetic changes brought about by the prions, we're going to see how different folks respond to it and how different folks who have this gene identify with what may be considered to be the vampire culture as that is actively developing. I also really love the name of this episode because I could not stop for death. It is from an Emily Dickinson poem of the same name, and it's one of her most popular poems that was written around 1863. And the whole concept of it is about immortality, much like vampirism here. So in the poem, the speaker is talking about how she's visited by a gentlemanly representation of death who takes her for a ride in his carriage. And because he's so polite as he stops for her, even as she is too busy to slow down even for death, she decides to lay aside her life because he's been so civil. And she goes on this ride with him and sees the past of her life and the people who are still alive, the lives that are forming even as hers is ending. As she says that we pass the school where children strove, at recess in the ring, we pass the fields of gazing grain, we pass the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. And so she's describing this passage of time and space as she is entering into death. And they arrive at her grave, which is described as a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. But then it continues. The arrival at her grave is not the end point of her trip, but rather it continues. And she says that since then to centuries and yet feel shorter than the day, I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So she is viewing this as an infinite afterlife. So in that she is entering towards the grave, but she is not scared of death in and of itself because she is viewing it more as an approach towards immortality, towards living eternally. And that is really how the vampires are seeing this, that they have an increased healing factor and they are looking at life and death in more of a cyclical balance. They are also perhaps looking at humans as being part of the food chain, of that cycle of which humans were the apex predators, and now perhaps the vampires are. But that when human life is extinguished as we know it, and replaced with the concept of vampires, this new life, it's not necessarily a death of humanity, but perhaps a rebirth or a move towards eternal life, an evolutionary adaptation in both nature and culture. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.